This program explores the work of some of the most widely recognized American authors: Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, and others. We will examine American literature in the years just prior to, during, and after the Civil War, when American writers began turning inward and confronting their innermost feelings of joy, grief, obsession, and alienation. The program continues with an exploration of the late 19th century literary movements called Realism and Naturalism, as well as an examination of the parallel development of regional variety in our nation's literature. In the mid-19th century, Boston was the national center of book publishing and of academic excellence. Harvard College, no longer a religious institution, was on its way to becoming a great university. The nearby village of Concord was the seat of what is now called the American Renaissance, where such literary giants as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne lived and wrote. The belief that God resides in all of nature and within each individual was one of the common threads of thought shared by many writers of the time. Their idealistic and romantic philosophy became known as Transcendentalism. The Transcendentalists' concern with the quality of a person's daily life on earth, also called humanism, marked a departure from the Puritan emphasis on heaven and hell. Ralph Waldo Emerson, sometimes called the Sage of Concord, believed that God's will could be discovered in the laws of nature.
It was always making these connections between what's happening in nature and what man's reaction to it is, his subjective interpretation of it. So Transcendentalism for both Emerson and Thoreau was a way of going beyond the material world into some spiritual or moral meaning that they could interpret out of that world. They used it in different ways, but that was the basic thing that they were both doing.
Starting with the belief that God's will could be discovered in the laws of nature, Emerson gradually came to oppose all organized religion as a barrier between God and the individual. Asserting that each human soul is divine, he said,
"Standing on the bare ground, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God."
Henry David Thoreau, a friend and devout follower of Emerson's, built a cabin at Walden Pond. There he wrote journals and wove them into a book called Walden.
"I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what..."
Thoreau was passionately opposed to slavery and to the war against Mexico. He wrote Civil Disobedience to explain his position.
"When a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize."
After sheltering a runaway slave, Bronson Alcott, another friend of Emerson's, wrote,
"Our friend the fugitive has given image to the dire entity of slavery, and it was an impressive lesson to my children."
One of those children was Louisa May Alcott, who wrote the popular novel Little Women. Louisa May Alcott's books and stories were drawn from her family's experiences and became their main source of income. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow shared the Transcendentalists' intense opposition to slavery.
New England was the center of this movement, and Thoreau and Longfellow were both very strong anti-slavery advocates. If you think about it, the whole foundation of American democracy is against the idea of slavery. If all men have rights and are created equal, then why are some men slaves?
Longfellow was also sympathetic to the poor treatment of Native Americans.
Longfellow looked at the Indians through a kind of romantic lens, where he saw them as having a really close connection with nature. You get this in some lines in the famous Song of Hiawatha, for example, where he says, "Then the little Hiawatha learned of every bird its language, learned their names and all their secrets, how they built their nests in summer, where they hid themselves in winter, talked with them whene'er he met them, called them Hiawatha's chickens."
The movement to abolish slavery had won great strength in the North, and the Transcendentalists, with their heritage of social conscience, were in the forefront of the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery to freedom, was a leader in the anti-slavery movement. His narrative of his life as a slave and his escape was widely read, also for its analysis of American social and political institutions.
He was a very brave man, and one of the indications of his bravery was that he identified his owner by name. And for Douglass to do this in 1845 meant that he was vulnerable to being recaptured and taken back into slavery.
I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears.
When the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1851, requiring New Englanders to turn in runaway slaves, Emerson urged all intellectuals not to cooperate.
I think we must get rid of slavery, or we must get rid of freedom.
Abolitionist speeches and writings never reached as wide an audience as did Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The book made readers feel the human suffering caused by slavery. In the years just before the Civil War, writers were intensely involved in the issues of their time, and in many cases had a strong influence on their contemporaries. But three major literary figures of the time, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, avoided or withdrew from involvement in these issues. Edgar Allan Poe appealed directly to his readers' senses and emotions. Poe believed that art should be created in the cause of beauty. In The Raven, the poet, tortured by memories of his dead love, Lenore, is visited one midnight by a mysterious raven. Desperate to find out if he will meet Lenore in another world, the poet questions the raven, but the raven speaks only the single word, nevermore.
He was fascinated by the powers of the imagination to create worlds that were not in the real world. And his fiction in different ways reflects that, as well as his poetry.
Annabel Lee is written in the form of a lyrical ballad and deals with a recurring theme in Poe's work, the loss of a beautiful, loved woman.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me.
To this day, Poe's horror stories, such as The Cask of Amontillado, The Black Cat, and The Fall of the House of Usher, are among his most popular works. Nathaniel Hawthorne first gained public attention when Poe hailed his talent. Fascinated by the psychological effects of Puritanism on New Englanders, Hawthorne took as his themes guilt, moral responsibility, and human destiny. The Scarlet Letter is the story of Hester Prynne, a young woman who is sentenced to wear a scarlet letter A as a token of her sin of adultery.
But the point which drew all eyes and, as it were, transfigured the wearer was that scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself.
So with Hawthorne, just as with Emerson, we can see a really direct line back to Puritan thought and ways of dealing with reality. Hawthorne was interested in the way that the imagination could delude and mislead people. And he was also doubting what we saw in reality, and often raising the question of whether what we saw was a dream or real.
Herman Melville was a friend of Hawthorne's. Melville's greatest works probed the dark side of the human mind. His most famous work, Moby Dick, is a study of the conflict between good and evil. Captain Ahab is a man obsessed with the great white whale that bit off his leg. For Ahab, the whale Moby Dick is
the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them.
For Melville, the question was, what does the outer world mean? And is there any definite meaning in the outer world? Moby Dick is the great example of this, where Captain Ahab tries to figure out the meaning of the whale. Is the whale evil, or is he good? Melville isn't sure about this.
Emily Dickinson, one of the nation's finest lyric poets, saw 19th century America in a very personal way. Her responsiveness to nature, her deep thoughts about death, immortality, and beauty, and her understanding of emotions all contributed to the complexity of her work.
Her poetry was not published during her lifetime, but once it was published, Emily Dickinson became a classic of American literature.
The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do as syllable from sound.
Though Dickinson's experience of the world was very limited, her experience of life was not, and it seems to me that that is captured even in this poem as it begins, the brain is wider than the sky, that this is not a person who travels physically, but she's a person who travels within, and where she can go inside herself is as vast as any pioneer woman crossing the American plain.
In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was becoming increasingly self-sufficient and prosperous. Cities grew, immigration increased, and communications and transportation routes were established nationwide. This was the golden age of the steamboat, which transported food from northern farms and cotton from southern plantations along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Improved farm machinery contributed to prosperity. A new sense of self-confidence was reflected in American literature. Walt Whitman saw the nation as a diverse one in which the spirit of the common man prevailed. In 1855, he published Leaves of Grass. Written without rhyme or meter, its 12 untitled poems were modeled on the rhythmic prose of the King James Bible. The form was so original that it altered the course of American poetry. In his preface to Leaves of Grass, Whitman writes,
The art of art, the glory of expression, and the sunshine of the light of letters is simplicity. Nothing is better than simplicity.
In Song of Myself, he invites the reader to participate in his experience.
I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end. But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now. And there will never be any more perfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. One of the interesting things about Whitman, a quality that he shares with Ralph Waldo Emerson, is the sense that it is the present, it is the immediate that matters. That in the America of the 19th century, one did not need to study the books of the past. One's own experience was a better guide to life than anything that one could read.
The realism that Whitman brought into poetry was that he was writing about the real world, the cities, the blab of the pavements, as he called it, the prostitutes even who were in these cities. He was writing about the drunkards, about the insane. These are not subjects that people wrote about at this time.
The works of Whitman, Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, and Dickinson were created during one of the most difficult times for the young nation, the years immediately preceding, during, and following the Civil War. As a result of that war, the country and its literature would change profoundly. American writers began to set for themselves a new standard, that of describing life around them as realistically as possible. They prized clarity, order, and economy of words. As writers drew upon their own locales, the South, the West, the Northeast, literature began to acquire a variety of regional flavors. Some called it the Gilded Age, borrowed from the title of a Mark Twain book. Twain viewed his world with affection and humor, even when he wrote satirically about social and economic conditions. Born in Missouri in 1835, Mark Twain drew upon his boyhood experiences along the Mississippi River. In Huckleberry Finn, Huck and Jim, a runaway slave, float down the Mississippi on a raft.
And one of the most important things about that text is that Huck is the narrator, a 13-year-old boy who does not speak standard English, whose English is not always, indeed perhaps not usually grammatical, is given narrative authority in that text. And his voice as his consciousness becomes the focus through which everything else we learn in that text is told.
We said there weren't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft.
One of the interesting things to trace in Huck Finn is the community that Huck and the slave Jim can establish when they're together on the raft, and the way that that community becomes impossible to sustain any time that they come ashore.
Twain described what he saw and heard around him and was a forerunner of the literary movement called Realism. Another author who captured the local color of a particular region was Bret Harte, whose focus was the West. In his story, The Luck of Roaring Camp, a child born in a mining camp loses his mother soon after his birth and is raised by the miners. Joel Chandler Harris wrote about a region in Georgia and created the character Uncle Remus, who entertains a small boy with stories about animals.
"Skip me, Brer Fox," says Brer Rabbit, says he. "Snatch out my eyeballs, tear out my ears by the roots, and cut off my legs," says he. "But do please, Brer Fox, don't fling me in that briar patch," says he.
Sarah Orne Jewett introduced the region around her home in Maine to a wide audience, while George Washington Cable captured the sparkle of city life in New Orleans. Stephen Crane took realism beyond established limits. The Red Badge of Courage, which dealt with the feelings and fears of soldiers in the Civil War, established Crane's reputation. The book's protagonist, Henry Fleming, is a farm boy whose romantic illusions about war are shattered when he confronts his own fear.
It seemed to the youth that he saw everything. Each blade of the green grass was bold and clear. He thought that he was aware of every change in the thin, transparent vapor that floated idly in sheets. You can see how this language is very poetic, too, as he's describing what his vision is and what his feelings are. The brown or gray trunks of the trees showed each roughness of their surfaces, and the men of the regiment, all were comprehended. His mind took mechanical but firm impressions, so that afterward everything was pictured and explained to him, save why he himself was there. That's quintessential Crane, that is giving us the strong picture of what it was like, but also telling us that there doesn't seem to be any reason for Fleming to be there, or finally for war to be in the world at all.
From 1891 to well into the 1900s, William Dean Howells was widely regarded as the most influential writer of his time. Howells' best-known work is The Rise of Silas Lapham, the story of a self-made businessman from Vermont who tries to make a place for himself in Boston society. Henry James, born in New York to wealthy parents, tells the story of a charming American in Portrait of a Lady, considered by some his best novel.
Isabel Archer spent half her time in thinking of beauty and bravery and magnanimity. She had a fixed determination to regard the world as a place of brightness.
Frank Norris created characters that became victims of their baser passions, such as greed or violence. In much of Norris's work, the men and women are depicted as unable to change the profound effects of their heredity and environment. This was a new trend in realistic literature called Naturalism. In McTeague, Norris depicts a character who cannot control his animalistic nature.
The brute that in McTeague lay so close to the surface leaped instantly to life, monstrous, not to be resisted. He sprang to his feet with a shrill and meaningless clamor, the hideous yelling of a hurt beast.
Jack London, like Norris, believed that men were sometimes motivated by primitive and violent instincts. In The Call of the Wild, a dog called Buck is stolen from a California estate and shipped to the Klondike, where he is trained as a sledge dog.
So he often puts his characters in situations that are very extreme in terms of being outside in the wilderness, trying to build a fire in cold weather that's absolutely frozen landscape. Or sometimes he puts us into animals, into, for example, the mind, as he imagined it, of a wolf. So the struggle of human beings to survive in nature, or the struggle of one animal against another animal for dominance, this was man's destiny for London. And it was a challenge for man to achieve some foothold on earth and in nature.
In the early 20th century, writers would be as affected as everyone else by a new and dramatic change. A world made suddenly smaller by the impact of the automobile, the telephone, and the airplane. Transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne were concerned with the quality of a person's daily life on Earth, also called humanism. The abolition of slavery became possible in part due to the brave writings of formerly enslaved blacks like Frederick Douglass. His slave narrative was widely read. Herman Melville's greatest work, Moby Dick, is a study of the conflict between good and evil. As American writers began describing life around them as realistically as possible, literature began to acquire a variety of regional flavors.